The story begins on the wide, unbroken plains of the North American frontier, where the horizon met the wind and the buffalo ruled the earth. Around the year 1831, a child was born near the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. His people would one day know him by a name that echoed through generations: Tatanka Ayotake, Sitting Bull. He came into a world still untouched by the cities of men, a world belonging to the Lakota, the keepers of the Great Plains. Sitting Bull was of the Hunkpapa band, one of the 7 council fires of the great Oseti Sakowin. They were wanderers of the northern plains, free, fierce, and bound to the rhythm of the land. His father, Jumping Bull, was a respected warrior and hunter. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, carried the same courage within her heart. From this proud lineage, the boy inherited not only a name, but a destiny. As a child, he was called Jumping Badger, sometimes Hunkesni, meaning slow, for he moved with thought and patience. Yet behind that calm, a fire of courage was already alive. Like every Lakota boy, he learned his lessons beneath the open sky. He rode before he could walk far, tracked before he could read the stars. Hunting, archery, endurance, and control were his teachers. Through pain and perseverance, he learned what it meant to be Lakota: brave, patient, generous, and humble. At 10 years old, he brought down his first buffalo, a sacred milestone that marked the step from childhood to manhood. At 14, he joined a war party and performed his first counting coup, touching an enemy in battle without killing him, an act of supreme bravery. That day, his father stood before the people, pride in his voice, and gave the boy his own name, Sitting Bull, the bull that sits unmoved in the storm. As he grew, he joined warrior societies like the Kit Fox and later co-founded the Midnight Strong Heart Society, circles of the bravest among the brave. His name soon became a symbol of calm defiance and quiet power. Before the arrival of white settlers, the Hunkpapa Lakota lived in harmony with the buffalo. The buffalo was life itself: food, shelter, clothing, and spirit. Their world moved with the seasons, following the herds that thundered across the prairie. Families lived together in great circles of teepees, each part of a larger whole. Land was not owned, it was shared, a sacred gift from the Creator. Each morning began with prayer, and every act was tied to the rhythm of the earth. But change was already whispering on the horizon. By the 1840s, new roads began to slice through Lakota land. Settlers pushed westward, wagons creaking across the plains, chasing gold and new beginnings. The great herds of buffalo began to thin, the grasslands faded under the weight of endless caravans, and the treaties meant to bring peace, like the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, were broken almost as soon as the ink dried. In 1854, the Grattan Massacre ignited the first spark of a long and bitter conflict. The young Sitting Bull watched and learned. Each broken promise carved deeper into his heart, the belief that his people's only safety lay in their own strength. He would not beg for peace. He would not yield his spirit. He would stand, calm, proud, and unshaken, as the storms of history began to gather. And so, from the windswept plains where he was born, the boy who was once called Slow began his journey to become the voice of a nation that refused to vanish. The mid-19th century. Across the vast plains of the North, one man's name begins to rise: Sitting Bull. Once a respected member of his tribe, he is now becoming something far greater: the spirit and strength behind what history would call the Great Sioux Resistance. His journey from a warrior to a leader is marked by battle, vision, and an unbreakable devotion to his people's freedom. Sitting Bull's power grew because he carried not one gift, but 2. He was both a warrior and a spiritual leader, a rare combination among the Lakota. As a proud member of the elite Strong Heart and Kit Fox warrior societies, he earned a reputation for pure fearlessness. He mastered the ancient tradition of counting coup, showing courage by touching an enemy in battle without killing them. By his mid-30s, his bravery had made him a war chief of the Hunkpapa, the kind of leader others followed instinctively. But there was another side to him, the side of the holy man. Among his people, he was known as Wichasha Wakan, the medicine man. He could read visions, interpret dreams, and see the signs that guided the destiny of his tribe. That sacred wisdom made his voice carry the weight of both earth and spirit. Then came the soldiers. After the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the peace was broken by a flood of U.S. military expeditions. The northern plains, once open and free, now echoed with the tramp of soldiers' boots. Sitting Bull fought back. During the Powder River War between 1865 and 1868, he led fierce retaliatory raids against forts and survey teams trespassing into Lakota lands. Even when he was not directly involved, as in the Wagon Box Fight of 1867, his influence was felt. He stood as a symbol of defiance, a warrior who would never yield. But a greater storm was coming, one that could not be fought with arrows and bullets alone. The white settlers moved west, driven by a belief they called manifest destiny, that it was God's will for them to take every piece of land between the oceans. Even treaties meant nothing. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which promised the Lakota their Great Sioux Reservation, including the sacred Black Hills, was violated again and again. Railroad surveyors crossed the borders freely, and settlers poured in. And then came the most devastating blow, the slaughter of the buffalo. The herds, once millions strong, were cut down by professional hunters. It was a deliberate act designed to destroy the native way of life and force the tribes onto government reservations. Sitting Bull understood what this meant. If the buffalo died, so would their freedom. So he began to unite his people. While some Sioux bands signed treaties and accepted reservation life, Sitting Bull became the voice of those who refused, the non-treaty bands, the Free Lakota. Under his leadership, the divisions between Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota began to fade. He reached out to other tribes, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and forged a powerful alliance. Together, they would fight not just for land, but for survival itself. His strength came from vision and resolve. His dreams were not personal, they were messages for his people, and his determination was absolute. "I wish it to be remembered," he once said, "that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." That promise became a prophecy. Through his courage and his faith, Sitting Bull became the living heart of the resistance, the spirit of the Lakota Nation, unbroken and unbowed. The summer of 1876 marked the turning point of the Great Sioux Resistance, a moment when courage, vision, and fate collided on the vast plains of Montana. This was the battle that would echo through eternity, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Along the banks of the Little Bighorn River stood the largest native encampment ever seen, over 7,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. They had gathered to defend their way of life, their freedom, and the sacred lands of their ancestors. Meanwhile, 3 U.S. military columns advanced under the command of General Philip Sheridan. Among them rode Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, ambitious, fearless, and fatally overconfident. On June 25th, 1876, believing he had surprised a small camp, Custer ordered an immediate attack. But what awaited him was not a scattered band of warriors. It was an army united under the spiritual and moral guidance of Sitting Bull. Days before the battle, Sitting Bull had performed the sacred sun dance, a 4-day ritual of pain, endurance, and prayer. In his vision, he saw soldiers falling from the sky, their bodies covering the ground like grasshoppers. It was a prophecy, a message from the Great Spirit foretelling victory for his people. The vision spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. Warriors prepared themselves, their hearts strong, their spirits unshaken. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall took command of the battle lines, while Sitting Bull's presence gave strength and unity to every fighter on the field. When the fighting began, it was swift and ferocious. Custer and his men found themselves surrounded by thousands of warriors. Gunfire and war cries filled the air. The earth shook with the charge of horses. In less than 2 hours, the 7th Cavalry was annihilated. Custer and more than 200 soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. It was a stunning native victory, a triumph of courage and prophecy, but it was also the beginning of a terrible reckoning. News of Custer's defeat spread like wildfire across the United States. In the cities of the East, outrage and vengeance took hold. The government responded with overwhelming force. Thousands of new soldiers were sent west. The sacred Black Hills were seized in open violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty, and the buffalo, lifeblood of the plains, were hunted almost to extinction. Starvation and despair spread among the tribes. One by one, the proud Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were driven to surrender. But Sitting Bull refused to bow. In the spring of 1877, he led his people north, across the border into Canada, the land they called Hokata, the other side. There, they sought peace and survival in exile. For 4 long years, they endured the bitter cold and hunger of the northern plains, but the buffalo herds were gone, and the Canadian government offered little help. At last, faced with the suffering of his children and the hunger of his people, Sitting Bull made a painful decision. In July 1881, he returned to the Dakota Territory, not as a defeated warrior, but as the last free chief of his nation. He surrendered his rifle at Fort Buford, keeping his word. "I wish it to be remembered," he said, "that I was the last man of my tribe to lay down my arms." Soft music fades in, mournful flute over distant wind. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was both victory and tragedy, a moment of unmatched glory that sealed the fate of a free people. Sitting Bull had won the battle, but the war for his people's future was far from over. The final chapter of Sitting Bull's life was written not in triumph, but in exile, hardship, and tragedy. After his great victory at Little Bighorn, the once unconquerable chief found himself walking a path of hunger, sorrow, and betrayal, a stark reflection of a people's fading freedom. In 1877, unwilling to bow to the U.S. Army, Sitting Bull led thousands of his loyal Lakota followers north, across the border into Canada, the land of Saskatchewan. He hoped that there, beyond the reach of the United States, his people might find true freedom and continue their ancient way of life. But the hope was short-lived. The buffalo, lifeblood of the plains, were vanishing from both sides of the border. Hunger and desperation spread like wildfire, and the Canadian government, unwilling to fully support the exiles, left them to struggle alone. By 1881, their strength was gone. With a heavy heart, Sitting Bull made the most painful decision of his life: to return. In July 1881, the proud chief rode down to Fort Buford in Dakota Territory. There, he laid down his rifle and said the words that would echo through history: "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." Sitting Bull and his people were sent to the Standing Rock Agency, a far cry from the free plains they once roamed. Life on the reservation was suffocating. He refused to farm or submit to the strict control of Agent James McLaughlin. Even in captivity, he remained a symbol of defiance, the living spirit of resistance. Then, in 1885, came an unlikely chapter in his story, one of spectacle and irony. Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill Cody's famous Wild West show, traveling across America and Canada. Audiences came in thousands to see the legendary Savage of Little Bighorn. They cheered, they gawked, they paid to shake his hand. But while they saw a relic of the frontier, Sitting Bull saw a broken world of wealth and poverty, greed and loss. He gave away much of his earnings to the poor and street children, sharing what little he had with those who had even less. After one season, he left the show, unwilling to be a performer in the story of his people's suffering. By 1890, a new movement began to spread across the reservations, a spiritual hope born out of despair: the ghost dance. It promised that through prayer and sacred dance, the buffalo would return, the white settlers would vanish, and the ancestors would rise again. Sitting Bull was intrigued, but he was not its leader. Still, the government saw the movement as a threat. To them, it looked like rebellion. And to Agent McLaughlin, the presence of Sitting Bull, the most influential of all Sioux leaders, made that threat unbearable. He decided to remove him once and for all. Before dawn on December 15, 1890, Indian police, acting under U.S. orders, surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin on the Grand River. The old chief was asleep. When the officers tried to take him, his loyal followers gathered outside, shouting in anger and confusion. A shot rang out. Chaos exploded in the cold morning air. Gunfire erupted between the police and his supporters. When the smoke cleared, Sitting Bull lay dead, struck down by one of his own people, serving another's command. His son, Crowfoot, was killed beside him. The spirit of the Lakota resistance died with them, just 2 weeks before the massacre at Wounded Knee. Soft, haunting flute and drum fade in, echoing across empty plains. Sitting Bull's death marked the end of an era, the closing of the great story of free Native America. Yet his spirit could not be buried. He remains, even now, a symbol of courage, pride, and the unbreakable will of a people who refused to vanish. His life was a lesson in resistance and a warning about the cost of empire. He lived and died for freedom, never once accepting peace on the conqueror's terms. For the modern world, his message endures. True sovereignty can never be taken, only surrendered. And Sitting Bull never surrendered.